So we're delighted to have today with us Professor Joshua Solomon from City University of London. Joshua Solomon is a professor of visual psychophysics at the Center of Applied Vision Research at City University of London. He did a BSc in psychology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and then an MA and PhD in psychology at NYU. He then did a postdoc at the Institute for Sensory Research, Syracuse University in New York. He then joined the National Research Council at NASA Ames Research Center, I think if I'm saying this correctly, Moffett Field, California. And then the Institute of Ophthalmology at UCL in London. Afterwards, he joined the Department of Optometry and Vision Science, City University of London as staff. He's on the editorial board of Journal of Vision, a guest associate editor in Attention, Perception, and Psychophysics Journal, where he was also an associate editor for several years. He published 80 peer-reviewed research papers, including in top high-profile journals as Nature, PNAS, Current Opinion in Behavioral Sciences. He also wrote multiple book chapters and also is the editor of a book. He also took part in a children's book that came out named Scientific Optical Illusions. His research involves investigation of visual psychophysics, addressing a very broad spectrum of questions, including color perception, attention, perceptual biases, motion-related aspects, numerosity, contrast, blur, noise, after effects, eye movements, and many additional topics in visual psychophysics. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Professor Josh Solomon, to our seminar today. Thank you for joining us, and pleasure to hear your recent results.
Yeah, the pleasure's all mine, Sharon. Thanks. Let's try in advance. So in 1877, Rico measured thresholds for detecting a light. And now I wanted to illustrate this, so I looked online for a graph, but Rico's original paper only contained tables with numerals, and it was in Italian, so I couldn't read it. So what I did find was this much more recent figure from 2019. It comes from Larry Tybos, his lab, and it has a replication data that replicate Rico's 19th century experiment, where the threshold for detecting a flash of light in the dark was measured with the independent variable being the size of that light. And Tybos and his colleagues got a good conceptual replication of Rico's experiment, where they found that threshold fell as the size of the light increased until that size had an area of about 100 arc minutes. And that area is, so just to be clear, so if you consider a circle around your head, that circle has 360 degrees, and each degree has 60 minutes. And the quote rule of thumb is if you hold your thumb up at arm's length, its width is somewhere between 1/2 and 1 degree. So this is much smaller than the width of your thumb, okay? It's the diameter is about 10 arc minutes. Now, you might think that area and radius are equally good metrics for describing the spatial summation for detecting any kind of visual target. But I prefer radius or diameter, and we'll get to the reason why later in this talk. What I should say about these data that I simply downloaded from the web is that Tybos and his colleagues weren't merely interested in measuring the detection threshold for a flash of light in the dark. They also measured the detection threshold for a flash of dark in the light. And they found that these thresholds were similar when expressed in units of retinal illumination, the Trollin. As an aside, I'd like to note that the extent of spatial summation isn't the only classic feature of light perception for which dark perception has an analog. The Brooke-Bartley effect is another, and that's the subject of a 2018 paper by me and Christopher. It isn't relevant to this talk, but you know, since in many ways this whole thing is just stuff that I've done, I'm including. I should say that the stuff that Christopher and I have done that I will talk about today, none of this has been published. It's all new, and hasn't been. There was a 5-minute version of it presented a few weeks ago at Society for Neuroscience, but other than that, this is the debut. Okay, so we set out to do something similar or analogous to what Rico did in the 19th century for detecting a light, but we wanted to do it for detecting motion. So take a look at this slide. In the upper left panel, there's a small blob of relatively intense light. The right panel shows one of our stimuli, the upper right panel, which contains a small blob of fast rightward motion. So in this sense, I think it's analogous to Rico's experiment, except for where they've got bright light, we've got fast motion. The lower panel shows a large disk. So the lower left panel shows a large disk that's less bright than its background. And the lower right panel shows one of our stimuli that contains a large disk that's less rightward than its background. In other words, it contains a large disk of leftward motion. Okay, so that's just the analogy between what we've done and what Rico did in the 19th century. For reasons that will become clear, I hope, later in this talk, we also decided to measure thresholds for detecting these same motion-defined targets in the presence of random fluctuations in velocity. And so I've extended the analogy to luminance here in this slide. The left-hand panels contain stimuli in the luminance domain. In each of our stimuli, each row of pixels was divided into 16 pixel groups. These 16 pixels would move with uniform velocity. Consequently, each row of pixels in the luminance domain analog has also been divided into 16 pixel groups. These 16 pixel groups have uniform luminance. All righty, I think that's all I have to say about that slide. Okay, there's a lot going on in this slide, so let's take it piece by piece. This slide contains all of the data that Christopher and I collected in the absence of any velocity noise. So the stimuli for these were like the 2 slides ago. 3 observers were required to discriminate between rightward drifting, motion-defined blobs, and otherwise identical stimuli containing no motion. In general, faster moving blobs were easier to detect. We've defined the peak velocity required for an 81% correct response probability as the detection threshold. Now, in these, let's just think about the graphs on the top of this slide. The vertical axis is threshold in decibels. Decibels are proportional to the logarithm of the velocities required for 81% correct response probabilities. The vertical axis in each panel extends from the slowest to the fastest velocities that our apparatus was configured to produce. So these are 0.02 degrees per second at the bottom and 0.45 degrees per second at the top. So in general, thresholds fell as the blob's space constant increased to a value somewhere between 1 3/4 degree of a visual angle, somewhere between 0.2 and 0.7 degrees. This limit on the spatial summation for motion detection, it seems to be analogous to RICO's much smaller limit on the spatial summation for detecting luminance. Now, let's look at the middle row of panels. These panels show data collected in an otherwise identical experiment, except here we used rightward drifting motion-defined disks. Disks were also used for the left-right discrimination experiment, illustrated by the bottom row of panels. So in this case, threshold was defined as the standard deviation of the normal distribution, best fitting the relationship between rightward velocity and the observer's probability of responding right instead of left. That was the observer's task. So they had to say whether the disk was moving left or right. And if the disk was moving right with a high velocity, they almost always said right. In each case, in all the things you'll see, the error bars contain 95% credible intervals. That's a Bayesian thing, credible intervals. I have fit the data in each panel with the same bilinear summation curve we saw in the first slide. Now, like the fit in that slide, the one that I pinched from Tybos et al., these fits are not remarkably close. But before we can explore other curves that might fit the data better, I'd like to make sure we can understand the model that produces these curves. So I created this flow diagram using a sort of symbols that I borrowed from some of my favorite papers by Barbara Doscher and Zhonglin Liu for another purpose altogether. But let's think about the two alternative forced choice tasks. Okay, in one alternative there's motion, in the other alternative there isn't. So this model, this single template model, says that decisions are formed by the comparison between two signals that are internal to the observer. Each of these signals has an expected value that's equal to the dot product between the external signal and something internal called a template. Now let's consider the external signal first. When the stimulus contains a blob-shaped modulation of velocity, the external signal also has a blob shape. The amplitude of the external signal is proportional to the blob's peak velocity. The template also has a two-dimensional shape, just like the external signal. Its size is one of the two free parameters in this model. The other free parameter determines the variance of internal signals. The model for left-right discriminations is similar, but since there's only one stimulus when I ask an observer, is it moving left or right? There's only one stimulus there. There's only one internal signal as well. So in the model for the left-right task says that the observer will report rightward motion if and only if that internal signal is greater than 0. The last thing to say about this single template model is that this is a version in which the variability of internal signals, it's injected into the flow of information processing after the external signal is matched with a template. That is, this is a late noise version, but it produces exactly the same curves as this early noise version, in which visual noise is added to the external signal before that signal is compared with the template. Okay, now let's consider what happens when we add random velocity fluctuations to the stimulus. When those fluctuations are small compared to the internal noise, we expect no change in behavior. However, when external noise is large, the variance of the internal signals will increase and thresholds should rise. And sure enough, thresholds do rise when motion-defined targets are presented with random velocity noise. This slide contains the same blue symbols you've already seen a couple slides back. But this slide also contains amber symbols and what's the other color? That they're green, I guess. So the amber symbols represent thresholds obtained when the standard deviation of velocity noise was 20% of our maximum velocity. And the green symbols represent thresholds obtained when the standard deviation was 40% of our maximum velocity. The thing to note is that the fits of our 2-parameter single template model, they're terrible, okay? The thresholds this high require so much internal noise that the effects of external noise remain negligible as far as this model is concerned. So from these fits, we infer that internal noise cannot be the only reason thresholds are so high. Another potential explanation is that the decision process has a less than ideal sampling efficiency because the template, the shape of the template, never matches the shape of the external signal. So this is our big idea, that templates aren't merely blob-shaped or disc-shaped. Instead, the shape of each template is the product of a blob or disc and a sparse grid of small receptive fields. The sparsity or coverage of these small receptive fields is the third free parameter in our single template model. So I should say this is why I prefer radius to area when describing summation curves, such as the one we saw in the very first slide. In our model, template area depends on sampling efficiency. That is, it depends on the sparsity or coverage of the receptive fields that comprise each template. However, the template radius does not depend on sampling efficiency. That's sigma sub x in this slide. So when describing the results of a summation experiment, I prefer to use radius or diameter or something like that as the independent variable, the thing on the horizontal axis. So let's go back to look at some of these results that we looked at before. Here, I've fit them with our 3-parameter model. That's the noisy, inefficient, single template model. And it's clear that it doesn't capture all of the variance in our data, but it's not too bad. We considered an extended model with separate templates for small and large targets. That could potentially capture some additional variance in our data, but the thing was, why stop at 2? What if observers could form templates of arbitrary size, at least up to a limit? So this is what I call the noisy, inefficient, size-limited observer model. And it doesn't require any additional free parameters. I should probably refrain from naming this. I have tried all of my career to come up to coin a term, and I have never succeeded. So here I'm trying again. I'm calling this the Nizlo model, noisy, inefficient, size limited observer. Let's see if it catches on. I'm pessimistic. But as I say, the thing is that it doesn't require any additional freak parameters compared to the single template version of this model, where we previously had a parameter that determined the size of that single template. We now have a single parameter that determines the size of the largest template. And this Nizlo produces a satisfactory fit to all of our data. Unlike any of the previous models that we've considered, the Nizlo's predictions depend on whether internal noise is early or late. This slide was produced with early noise. Summation curves obtained with late noise were much steeper than these, and consequently they captured significantly less of the variance in our data. Finally, taking a look at this, I'd like to note that the Nizlo, you could say it degenerates into the ideal observer when its three free parameters take certain values. So when the largest template in the Nizlo is larger than the largest target, and the variance of its internal noise is 0, and its sampling efficiency, the coverage of the receptive fields that comprise the templates, when that sampling efficiency is 100%, then the Nizlo is the ideal observer for this task. And I think that's all I had to say about that. So, okay, our main findings. Number 1, in central vision, the template for motion detection has a radial extent of approximately half a degree. Now, in 1987, Albright and Desimone, they provided what they call a rule of thumb formula for inferring the relationship between retinal eccentricity and the size of the corresponding direction selective receptive fields in medial temporal cortex, MT. So using Albright and Desimone's formula, receptive fields at the fovea should have radii of 0.59 degrees. As you can see, it's an excellent match to the best fitting values for Nizlo's largest templates, and it's approximately 5 times greater in spatial extent than Rico's area. Okay, second bullet point here. Motion detection is limited by internal noise and a sampling efficiency of, here it says, approximately 2%. In fact, our estimates of sampling efficiency, there's a separate estimate for each one of the graphs in that slide that I kept showing. I guess there were 8 graphs. So we have 8 estimates of sampling efficiency, and those varied from between 1 and 4%. These numbers, they're considerably smaller than analogous estimates for the detection of targets defined by luminance or contrast. When I was working out sampling efficiencies for letter identification, those were like 10%. And sampling, there's a classic paper looking at sampling efficiencies for the most easily detected drifting gratings, and those can be as high as 30%. At present, I don't have any good idea for why motion detection should be so relatively inefficient compared to the detection of contrast or luminance. Now, we've attributed this inefficiency to a sparse grid of small receptive fields. However, I should stress that the curves I presented in the previous slide, they weren't computed with any grid like that. Instead, I used a simple closed form approximation for the expected values of the mean and variance of internal signals in our Nizlo model. So this closed form approximation is certainly a reasonable strategy for large templates that are comprised of many small receptive fields. On the other hand, I want to pause for a moment to consider what happens as the spatial extent of the template shrinks to something like the size of 1 or 2 receptive fields. So if the template were centered on a receptive field, then efficiency would increase as the size of the template decreased, right? Because it's sort of the size of the template is decreasing onto the size of 1 receptive field, and there isn't any space between receptive fields in the template. On the other hand, if the template were centered between 2 receptive fields, then efficiency would decrease as the size of the template decreased. In the former case, we would expect summation curves that were significantly steeper than those in the previous slide. And in the latter case, we would expect summation curves that were significantly shallower. Now, if our data contained compelling evidence for steeper or flatter summation curves, I might have explored, more sophisticated models where I actually, did some Monte Carlo simulation or something with grids of receptive fields. But our data didn't really contain any evidence for steeper or flatter curves. So in a sense, I think this closed form approximation, the simple closed form approximation that I use, is a reasonable strategy. I think that's all I had to say about that. Hang on, let me just, what happens if I click here? Yeah, that's not all I wanted to say about this. So, okay. So Christopher, my co-author for all of these experiments, might disagree with me here, but I have this feeling that that motion detection is a kind of an esoteric thing to be studying. In a way, contrast detection or even discrimination between things that are darker and brighter than the background, that's somehow more fundamental than motion detection. And the thing is that in everything I've said about the Nizlo, right? Nothing is specific to motion detection. All the Nizlo could be applied to contrast detection or luminance detection, and in fact, it has been. If he didn't call it that, but if you go back and look at there's a chapter I read by Dennis Pelly called "The Quantum Efficiency of Vision." This is right out of that chapter. The thing is, the Nizlo has problems with data on contrast detection and luminance detection that it doesn't have with motion detection. And so in a sense, you could accuse us of going for the low-hanging fruit first, something that was easier to explain, and we're certainly guilty of that. So one of the things that the Nizlo has problems with in motion detection, in contrast detection, for which there are no analogous problems in motion detection, is this slope of the psychometric function. So that's what I'm showing in this. That's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about in this slide. So in 1981, Cohn and Lastly noted that single template models necessarily predict a proportional relationship between target contrast and detectability whenever performance is limited by external noise. Now, they attributed this proof to Ted Birdsall, although I couldn't find anywhere in the literature where Birdsall actually described this. Nonetheless, it's now known as Birdsall linearization. For arcane reasons, I will not rehearse here. It's become conventional to fit psychometric data with viable functions whose slopes are defined by the shape parameter beta. The relationship between D prime and target contrast will be approximately proportional when beta falls between 1.3 and 1.4. So that's what I'm showing sort of in the leftmost curve of the upper panel of this figure. I should note that each of these panels, they contain the same 4 psychometric functions. And I should also note here that although the Nizlo has multiple templates, only one template is used at any time. That is, only one template is used for each target. Thus, the Nizlo, the noisy, inefficient, size-limited observer model, it also predicts Birdsall linearization. That is, the Nizlo predicts psychometric functions where beta equals approximately 1.3, regardless whether the target is defined by contrast or motion. Okay. I lied when I said I would only be presenting new data. The left half of this slide contains figure 5 from a paper, one of my older papers with Christopher, in which we measured the effect of practice on psychometric functions for contrast detection. The top panels were collected in the absence of external noise. The bottom panels were collected when external noise had a root mean squared contrast of 20%. Now, I should stress that it takes on the order of 1,000 trials to estimate just one psychometric slope with any kind of precision. And the estimates all of the estimates that I'm talking about today, they were based on a mere 256 trials. Or rather, I should say each estimate was based on 256 trials. Nonetheless, in our old paper on contrast detection, we could safely reject the null hypothesis that beta equaled 1.3. Indeed, we found no effect of practice or external noise on psychometric slopes for contrast detection. And the median value we found across all observers in all conditions was a value where beta equaled 4.0. And this value agrees very well with a meta-analysis run by Baker and Meese in 2012. They analyzed 14 studies of contrast detection where performance was limited by the external dynamic noise. In their meta-analysis, they found a median value of beta of 3.5, very close to our 4.0 and very far from the Nizlo's prediction of 1.3. So this high value of psychometric slope beta for contrast detection is not consistent with Birdsall linearization. Consequently, the Nizlo is not a good model of contrast detection. On the other hand, the right half of this slide, I collected before any of the data I've previously shown, using the same motion-defined blobs that we used for the top row of panels in the slides that I showed before. Indeed, the layout and color scheme of this panel on the right here, they're identical to all the previous slides, but here I've plotted maximum likelihood estimates of psychometric slope in each of these conditions. And the data, well, let's just say they suggest no consistent effect of external noise or size on the psychometric slope or rather on the slope of psychometric functions for motion detection. And the median value of beta is exactly 1.3, which is exactly what the Nizlo predicts. So yeah, do I have a conclusion slide? Yeah, here are the conclusions of my talk. So contrast detection is not consistent with the noisy, inefficient, size-limited observer model, but motion detection is. To fully account for spatial summation in contrast detection, a Nizlo-like model would require modifications like multiplicative internal noise, internal noise that grows with the size of the internal signal rather than just gets added to the internal signal. Another thing that you could do is to have a gain control. Another thing you could do, and this was something Christopher and I found necessary for our explanation of contrast detection, where we didn't vary the size of the stimulus, was intrinsic uncertainty. So that is, we had observers base their decision on the maximum activity in a number of templates that had different spatial and temporal preferences. Indeed, I mean, the fact is the literature, and maybe we'll tackle these issues in our next seminar. But until then, I'm just going to say thank you for listening, and find out if there are any questions from the audience. That's all.
Thank you very much, Josh. I'd like to ask everybody to unmute yourselves, and let's give Josh a big applaud for a very interesting talk. I myself have a few questions, but I'll let the audience ask first, but we'll see. Okay, I see that Ellie Pelly has a question. You're welcome to unmute yourself. Oh, you were unmuted. So yes.
Hi, Josh. Good to see you. The question I have is that the motion question was right versus left, where the contrast detection is not binary in that nature. If you had set the contrast detection to be light versus dark, which you had started your talk with this concept, could it change to be fit better by your Nizlo?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Ellie. In fact, so we did both two alternative force choice discrimination between motion and no motion, as well as direction classification, left versus right. The Nizlo can predict the results of both experiments.
Right. Yeah, but I'm asking for the contrast. Your contrast thing doesn't have that left versus right, or which will be light versus dark.
Yeah, it's true. The paper that I described of old results that I collected with Christopher, it was just, in fact, it was 4 alternative force choice. There was one grading and 3 blend. We have looked at psychometric slope in tasks where observers had to say whether a target blob was brighter or darker than the background, and also brighter and darker than alternative blobs that were given pedestal vapor contrasts. That was work I did with Mike Morgan and Millie Lavie, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, something like that. And in that case, we didn't apply the Nizlo. I suspect the Nizlo would have similar problems in the sense that the psychometric functions for that task were also very steep. Indeed, I mean, this is not so much an answer to your question, but I presented those data at the one time I attended Optical Society okay, it was the 90s. And I got up and I explained the results using a nonlinear model of contrast detection based on my reading of Gordon Legg and John Foley's work. And Christopher Tyler stood up in the audience and said, "What about uncertainty?" And I said, yeah, you have a point there, Christopher. And in a sense, that was the beginning of our collaboration.
And one technical thing, in your graphs, you said that you fitted bilinear lines, right? And a number of them led off by some illusion, or they look to have clearly three segments where one is at the transition between the split and flesh.
You're right, Ellie. In fact, some of those curves are slightly curved at the elbow. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure why that is. Okay. It's probably an artifact of the way I plotted it, you know. But to be honest, I don't know. I mean,
okay. All right, yeah. Fine. I just look at it. You say,
yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So I thought maybe there was a new illusion being shown. But okay, well, thanks.
Thank you. Jeremy Wolf, do you want to?
Hi, Josh.
Hi, Jeremy.
My question was whether or not you'd ever tried your motion experiment with chromatic stimuli, and if you did, does that just maybe make pooling areas larger, or does it make the whole thing go to hell in a handbasket? To be technical about it.
No, you know, color is hard and I try and avoid it. Christopher is pulling me into the color world, but
yeah, I thought that Christopher might have.
We haven't done the motion,
but not yet. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Oliver, Jan.
Yeah. Hi, Josh.
Hi, guys.
It's in the starting point of your work was to say this variable is light intensity or something similar in contrast, and then you look for a motion analog, and you make your intensive variable velocity. And I'm deeply unhappy with that. I mean, clearly the motion system is designed to work over a range of velocities. You can, other kinds of measure can show its performance at different velocities. I guess what this connects to is how actually is motion represented in your template? Is that a sensible way?
Right. So the template is just a function mapping space to gain. Okay, the gain has no units, and we are arbitrarily, well, is it completely arbitrary? I mean, we don't know, and we don't really care what the units of the internal signals are, whether it's, you know, spikes per second or heartbeats per minute or whatever. It's just some internal signals of an internal amplitude, at least in most of my models.
But it's a unit that has some kind of relationship between the stimulus and that variable.
Right. Right. What we wanted to do is we wanted to have something that was completely analogous to Rico's experiment, where instead of luminance or Weber contrast, we had motion. And so when Weber contrast is 0, there should be no motion. And so that's anyway. We chose velocity. I suppose, you know, someone else could choose something different.
Well, let me put that another way. I mean, you chose actually very low velocities. Suppose all your stimuli had been zipping along at 50 degrees per second or something, and it would actually be quite hard to discriminate leftwards versus rightwards motion in those circumstances. does that completely change the game?
Absolutely.
So which is the right game?
Well, it's a different question. I mean, if you were to flash lights, that were, one was as bright as the sun and one was, 1/10 the brightness of the sun, you wouldn't be able to discriminate between them. There is to be fair, there's a range that we investigated and there's a range that we didn't. We investigated the range near zero motion, just like Rico investigated the range near zero Weber contrast.
Yeah, I guess I'm just skeptical as how far that choice is really isolating the key functions of the motion system.
Yeah, well, it's really, we were really only trying to get at the spatial summation for really detecting motion, right? So we had to compare it with something where there was zero motion, not with something where there was a lot of motion.
Right. Well, clearly, it's a completely different experiment where you could get a critical size, and I think people have tried, where motion coherence is the variable.
Right, complete different experiment, right.
I prefer that experiment personally.
People do what they're interested in. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Josh, there's a question in the chat by Rina Durai. I think she is asking, or he maybe, can Nizlo be applied even for temporal summation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Rina is a she.
Okay.
Thanks,
Sorry.
Rina. That's all right. Yes, indeed. So in fact, the thing that the internal, in the 2AFC experiment, you compare two internal signals, or the thing that's really, we didn't vary the temporal extent, but we could have, right? We could have sought something analogous to Bloch's law for luminance, just like we sought something analogous to Rico's law for luminance, where you look at, see how summation depends on duration, luminance or Weber contrast. These detection thresholds that are discriminating something from nothing, they really, these laws say that what matters is energy. So that is, it's the product of spatial extent. It's a product of horizontal spatial extent, vertical spatial extent, and temporal spatial extent, and amplitude squared. That's the important thing in all of these models, in Rico's law and in Bloch's law. Yeah, perhaps that's the next logical thing to do, is to look at temporal summation instead of spatial summation.
Thanks, Josh.
Okay. By the way, I'm sorry my video is off. I have issues with the connection, so I'm trying to make that a bit more efficient. Okay, Christopher actually wrote in the chat, so I'm going to read it. It's a mix of a question and an aren't the contrast discrimination data also consistent with a hard threshold model? And then I think the non-bilinear shape is an artifact of interpolation between the sampled values. So Christopher, you're welcome to comment on that yourself.
Yeah, so the answer, it's unfair when your colleague lobs you a softball question, but hey, the contrast discrimination data are not consistent with a hard threshold model. So that in fact was like the title of the paper that Christopher and I wrote that had that figure 5 in it. The other question was about, I forgot, sorry, memory is not my strong point. What was the other question, Christopher? Do you want to?
It's just about the shape of the fitted functions that Eli Pelli was asking. I thought it was just an artifact of only computing the fit at discrete samples.
That's got to be correct. Yeah.
Thank you. Peter Neri also wrote, thanks a lot, Josh. I have to leave. I'm in the middle of data collection. And I myself, I see Ellie has another question, but before we go on to another round, I want to ask if you think the fact that, okay, Nizlo, I think that's the name of the model. Do you think the difference that you found between the motion and the contrast has to do with the fact that basically motion and form were found to be relying on separate or, somewhat independent mechanisms in the visual cortex? So do you think that may be supporting this distinction?
Well, yeah, there has to be some reason why psychometric functions for contrast detection are so steep and psychometric functions for motion detection aren't. And I mean, I don't really know. I don't really have a clue. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Okay, I actually have to say that I mean, I would think that maybe motion would get closer to contrast when the speeds are not so fast, as Lauren said, and I don't know. I mean, even I would think that they would even be further apart if the motion speeds are faster. But again, this is just very, just a guess. Thank you. Ellie, do you want to ask another question? Do you have another question that, because you have.
Can I ask my, I'd like to go back to that temporal question and the spatial temporal, if you want. In 1999, Garcia Perez and I published a paper in which we tested this kind of right-left discrimination of motion and showed that we could explain almost 100 type of situations, all of them in just low-pass filtering. So low-pass filtering of the scene accounted for the performance in pass filtering is not that much far from your template being a Gaussian. It performs a low-pass filtering of sort. So I think this is very consistent with this. And I like this kind of things because they're simple. Low-pass filtering is there. No one would argue it's not there. And if low-pass filtering can explain a performance, then we should go with that before we go with anything more complicated.
So thanks for that question, Ellie. And I apologize for not being familiar with that paper of yours and Miguel's. The challenge, however, is to
it's in the
low-pass
Optical
filtering.
Society. That's why you.
Okay. The challenge to a purely low-pass filtering model, I think, would be to find out whether it is consistent with the low efficiencies that I reported. So is it possible that it can at the same
simultaneously
explain both thresholds in the absence of external noise and thresholds in the presence of external noise?
We didn't explore that, and certainly didn't explore the sparsity of the samples, which is becoming more interesting as we get better view. But anything that could go lower with explanation is preferable, obviously, and low-pass filtering is undeniably there.
Josh, is it okay that I ask another question? I wanted to ask if you think that the model is, I mean, if there's going to be different results if you, I mean, it seemed that you used translational motion to some extent, right or left translational motion. And I'm wondering if you change the type of motion, say, either rotational or, I mean, there was a suggestion about motion coherence, but I'm also talking about the actual, whether it's spherical or even 3D motion. Like one of your examples, it seemed to me that one of the it looked like a sphere rotating in some way. Anyways, so if there would be either biological motion or 3D motion, do you think that would make a change to the fit or to the prediction in some way?
So, I mean, that's a great question, because in a sense it was the one of the things that really, I would say, interested Christopher long before he and I had a chat on any related issues was how motion parallax acts as a cue to depth. And it's something that we wanted to something that we would like to both of us would like to understand better. And it seemed like, you know, I always have this push to, maybe the similar to Elias, is try to understand the most fundamental things before complicating it. So I wanted to know how well motion was detected before I attempted to understand how motion signals can. Now, in those figures that I presented, those do at high amplitudes convey depth, as you saw. At the detection threshold, not so much. And what I don't have a good, you know, it suggests, your question suggests an experiment that I don't know how to run, which is I'd like to measure thresholds for motion in depth. That's different from thresholds for detecting motion, which are going to be smaller.
Yeah, definitely, very different.
So if anyone has any ideas, mail them to us. Mail them to me.
Okay, so I'll try to think up of a conceptual experimental design for testing this. It's not that yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Josh, for a very inspiring talk. And again, many thanks for joining us in our seminar.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much.
Lovely. And next week we will have Laurie Wilcox with us, which she will talk about how much depth do you see? It depends. And I'm inviting everybody to also join us. So thanks again, Josh, and have a lovely continuation of the day, week.
Nice to see you all. And see you next time.
Yes, thank you very
And
much.
happy Hanukkah to everybody.
Okay.
Since
Right.
we're in Bar Ilan.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.